Pleasure.
It's great to have you. Now, was it early 2020 when we were in Mary Kravitz? That's where we met Mary Kravitz. Was that,
It
or was that
was.
2019? I'm just like foggy with that one.
I think it was. I think it was 20. I think it was 2020.
Yeah, it was
I
2020.
think it was. I think it was January, February,
Yeah, and
um,
March, part of March.
and part of March before. Oh, I'm not sure. It might have been 2019. I think it might have been 2019. I think I was living in.
Wow.
I think I was living in North Carolina at that
Yeah,
point.
yeah. Well, it all escapes me for obvious reasons we're
It
not going to
does.
talk about.
It
So
does.
today's like April 30th, 2021. And anyway, Chris and I met at in Mary Kravitz. I don't remember the name of her workshop. It was I think it was more leads, less marketing, something like
Yeah.
that, which was really, really, really good for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you and I had a great conversation about, you teaching me how to use LinkedIn, which
Yep.
was really awesome.
Yep.
And then you reached out to me, I don't know, a month or so ago, and we wanted to get you on this podcast to talk about storytelling.
A
So,
passion of mine.
well, it's a passion of mine too, because I don't know if you can tell the book over there, but that's
Yeah.
Donald Miller's Building a Story Brand. And I just absolutely love stories. And, like, I don't know, 2 months ago, I wasn't a writer, and now I am because I jumped into a writing workshop with a guy named Kent Sanders at Daily Writer after listening to a podcast that he would do Monday through Friday, 2 or 3 minutes of just writing tips. And I thought,
Nice.
I can do this. I can do this.
Congratulations. It is. The hardest part about creating content is just starting. And then once you
Yeah.
start, I tell people who are thinking about or wanting to start, there's no longer a barrier to entry in terms of technology. You want to create, start creating. You want to be a
Yeah.
painter, start painting. You want to be a writer, start writing. You want to be, in front of the camera, in front of a microphone, start doing it.
Yeah. So where you live, did they have waves? Could you actually learn to surf?
They don't. So surfing on the Potomac might be a little challenging, but
Yeah, but you could do it. Maybe get pulled by a motorboat or
yeah,
something.
there you go.
So what's your history with storytelling? In fact, why don't you? I'm just curious. How did you get started storytelling? Was there a big aha, which is
Wow, no, I had a wild imagination as a kid, and I
and
was writing stories from third, fourth grade. I remember when I was in fifth grade, I won a scholarship to take a writing course, with some other 12-year-olds from upstate New York, which is where I grew up, and so that's kind of how it started. And where it really got serious is when I was a journalist for 25 years. I realized early on when I got to high school that I was not an athlete, but I loved sport and I loved to write. So I became both a news and sports writer for the high school newspaper. I was the public address announcer for the wrestling team and the local hockey team in town. And my friends and I did a public access TV show. And that I was one of the lucky ones in the sense that I knew right away what I wanted to do. And so I really kind of, and for the next 25 years, I was working as a working journalist, went to both undergrad and got a master's degree in journalism and writing, and then went to and worked in local television for about 10 years, and then worked in network television for about 15 years. All behind the scenes, mostly behind the scenes. I started off when I was in college. I was in front of the camera and behind the microphone, and then realized that where the power was actually behind the scenes in terms of the editorial judgment of what stories you're covering and how you're covering them and what angle you're approaching them with. And I found that to be much more interesting to me than getting my mug on camera. And so I opted to stay behind the scenes and work my way up in doing that. And then and now I now have pivoted to a portfolio career where I teach storytelling at Wake Forest University as part of a documentary film program.
Nice.
And I am also an executive coach and leadership consultant. And a lot of my work is working with executives and brands on telling their story. A lot of times, where companies and brands fall down is that they really can't tell their story in a way that connects with people, whether that be someone they're leading, someone they're managing, or a brand that, they're trying to get you to buy something. So I work with them a lot on their story. And so it's been a part of my life for ever since I can remember.
Yeah, that's really great. I was going to ask you if you'd be willing to give us a sample of your sport announcing voice.
Well, the funny story about that was when I was in high school and I was the public address announcer for the wrestling team, was at the time that my voice was changing. So there's nothing more embarrassing than getting behind the microphone and saying, "Now wrestling," and you would do it, and I would get mortified, and all the moms in the audience would look over at the table with this cute look on their face.
Yeah, I'm sure they thought it was very cute.
Oh, they did, and it was one of those things where it was, and literally in the course of 10 days, people would call my house and I'd pick up the phone. They would say, "Joyce." And 10 days later, I'd answer the phone. They'd say, "Jack." And so, which were my parents' names. And so, yeah, so being a public address announcer where your voice was changing was probably my most humbling moment behind the microphone.
Yeah, well, it kind of reminds me, I took a trip with my partner years ago to, we were living in New Mexico at the time. She's still there, actually. We're separated by COVID, soon to end. Oops, said we weren't going to mention that word. Anyway, went to Pinehurst, North Carolina,
Yep.
and picked up her mother and stepfather and drove them to Orlando for Disney World. And they had to stop at what they called a restaurant I never heard of and they pronounced it the Waffle House. So it reminds me a little bit of that. Sorry to break up this.
That's all right. Yeah.
So let's talk about.
You can't head south without hitting a Waffle House.
Yeah. So it's great. So let's talk about the elements of good storytelling. Where do you start with somebody? I mean,
boy, I think it starts with character. I think it starts. It starts with what I tell people is it starts with character and connection. And the first thing you need to do, especially when you're trying to give somebody information, is you need to make a connection with them first. You need to find that commonality just to get them to open their ears enough to hear what you're having to say. So when it comes to working with, as I say, brands and bosses, it's all about connection. How are you connecting with your team? How are you connecting with your audience? When I'm working with people who are actually telling stories and trying to find stories, for my creators in the world, I tell them two things. I say one of the first places I always start with is a world. What's the world you're taking me into? Because I have found that if you can take me into an interesting world, chances are you're going to find interesting characters in that world. So I always start there. And that's as simple as if COVID makes it a little different, but if you think about all the places that in a given week that you go in the normal course of things, and that could be work, it could be your neighborhood, your apartment building, your church, your coffee house, all the places that you go, those are all different worlds, and there's different people in those worlds, and everybody has a really interesting story to tell, but it's got to have a connection to it. It needs to. You really need to find what it is that's common that really connects people.
Yeah. When I started this podcast, I decided to name it "What Has My Attention," and the reason, and it's a little bit about podcasting, and it's a whole lot about life and what has my attention in life, because it's a little bit at my age. I'm not trying to I don't have the same aspirations that a 30 or 40-year-old does. And I, like 2 years ago, I just woke up one morning and kind of went, oh my God, my experience, my life. What stories do I have? And
Yeah.
then, like I said, a couple of months ago, it's like, okay, let's write about these
Yeah.
and hopefully share with people so that, like you said, to make a connection so people know who I am, not who I'm trying to be, but who
Right.
I am.
Oh, and authenticity is one of the most important aspects of storytelling and character, and on any level, right? So when I'm coaching executives, are you being authentic with the people, with your staff, and with your management team? And the
Mm-hmm.
same thing goes true for for identifying characters in a creative endeavor. They have to be authentic and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that because that allows for the connection, right? I mean, we've all met folks who aren't authentic and real, and it's very hard to root for those folks, and as a result of which, it's very hard to make them the center of your story. It's just that authenticity and the more you can tap into that, and the more you can reveal it, the more compelling the content is.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just curious if you work with speakers, because I've heard a lot of speakers that spend the first 10 minutes talking about all their credentials and their success and everything. But it's the speakers that get up there, the storytellers, that
Yeah.
actually say, 2 years ago, I was living in my back end of my car.
Yeah.
And people go, oh, and it catches their attention because obviously they've had some success or they wouldn't be there speaking, and they have a story to tell.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. The folks who go out there and try to um, impress you with what they've done to get there or to that it's not making that connection. It's they it's I always tell people when it comes to having a conversation with someone where you're trying to make a case, right? So whether that's, make a case for why you're up on that stage, make a case for why you should get the job, why you make a case for whatever that is. I always tell people, and we talked about this in Mary's class actually, is I remind them it's not about you. We get so wrapped up in all the things that we want to say. You're in a job interview. You're just dying to tell them all the reasons why that you're the best person for the job, and you're in front of a group of people. You're so hell-bent on them understanding why they chose you to be up there. And it's not about you. It's not about what you have to say. It's about what the audience is open to hearing. It's about what they want. It's about what they need to hear. And if you can tap into that, that's how you make your mark. That's how and you do that by being authentic, by making that connection point. If you can't connect with the audience, then you're just talking.
Yeah.
But finding that connection point, and humility is a great way to do it. It's just by starting off with that story,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll relate to it.
Mm-hmm. So you do work with speakers then?
I do.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
You're looking at a prospect.
Happy to. No, it's a fun challenge, and it always starts with kind of, so what do you want to say? What do you want when the audience leaves the room?
Mm-hmm.
What do you want them to know about you, and what do you want them to think about you?
Mm-hmm.
And then you backtrack from there and say, because to your point at the beginning, it's about authenticity. If you're up there, if you're up there, talking about something you're passionate about, that passion will come through, and it will pull people in. It's when people kind of go through the motions, or that animatron where people just don't pay attention.
Yeah. Do you think it's also, would you agree that you're not going to be able to pull everybody in?
Oh, correct.
Being authentic.
Correct.
Being unauthentic, if you're like rah, 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 you're going to pull in those kind of people. But if you're authentic, you're going to pull in people that are most likely going to follow you to some degree.
Correct. Yes. The authenticity. Yes. Being authentic and real is, you are going to leave some people behind. And I would argue that those were people that were going to leave you anyway. They just hadn't found the time. Because to your point, if you go out and say, are that rah person, that rah and cheerleading can only last for so long. And eventually, you're going to have one of two things. Either people are going to stop following you, or you're going to have a lot of people following you who you don't like very much.
Yeah.
which is not, I would rather be authentic and know that I'm talking with and conversing with what I would call, quote unquote, my people, because there was something about me that they connected with.
So where has this, where do you find yourself taking people typically, and what are some of the biggest challenges that most people in writing their story actually face?
I think the biggest challenge people have when writing their story or coming up with their story is they don't see it. A lot of what I do when I work with people, whether students and executives, is the first thing we do is first I make them buy a journal, which they hate, and I make them write in their journal, which they hate.
Can't use a computer.
I prefer not. I tell them not to. I encourage them not to. Everyone's different these days.
Sure.
What I tell people is, do it. For me, it's more important that you do it. So that's the basic thing is start however it works. We do know from neuroscience that if you actually write it out, you are more likely to remember it. But it's really the habit of getting into. And why I also like the journal piece of it is because you can throw it in your bag and you can pull it out. You can pull it out in the airport where you're waiting to get on a plane. I mean, there are moments when you have those moments of inspiration or have those, because once the thing about being creative, and I'm hoping you're seeing it when you've started your writing, is once you start that process, it just comes and it comes and it comes and it comes and it'll come at the weirdest time. Like you'll get a creative inspiration. Like I tell my students, I want you to start a creative journal and I want you to write about it, because what you'll find is once you start doing it, more ideas will come and more creative thoughts will come in, and you just start seeing things that you didn't see before. They were probably always there, you just didn't see them. So a lot of what I talk about when it comes to stories, the first thing is just opening your eyes. And for professionals, that means, looking at your past, looking at your skills. So one of the first things I do with executives who are looking for a job is I get them to do an inventory of the skills that they have. And most folks don't think of it that way. If you ask anyone what they do for a living, like, I do this, I get up and I do this, and we don't think about all of the intricate skill sets necessary to do what you do for a living, because it's just work. It's just what we do.
Yeah.
And so really getting people to take ownership of their own story and their own experiences is one of the harder things, because we just kind of move on.
If I may, as I told you, I'm in a writing group with Kent Sanders, and so when I got into it, I ran across a quote that's sitting right in front of me by Nikki Giovanni. I don't know if you know who she is.
No.
The quote is, "Writing is a conversation with reading, a dialogue with thinking."
Nice.
And when I took that, because I'm the kind of person that takes something like that and then, quite frankly, applies it to see how it works. And when I would read that and start writing, I found it to be absolutely true, which is very different than me attempting to use like Google Transcribe or something, which I have used before, to basically, talk it out and have it be transcribed. And then you have to go through a whole editing process.
Right.
It's not the same. Not even close.
No.
Not even close. But writing is a conversation with reading, a dialogue with thinking. And
that's great. It is. And again, it's one of those things I encourage people to do. And like, what should I write about? It's like, just write whatever. I mean, sometimes I give people homework. It's like, but it's like, just write whatever comes to your mind. And again, once you get in the habit of doing it, you'll just start seeing things, and you may not know, especially if you're a creative and you're trying to write stuff. So you'll see snippets of things that are just interesting. I'm sitting in a coffee shop and I'm overhearing the conversation next to me, and you write down a little bit about it. Who knows what you'll do with it? You may never do anything with it, but just the fact that you're starting to see the world around you, and if you're a storyteller, there are stories everywhere if you just know where to look
Yeah.
and the questions to ask. Everybody you meet has an interesting story to tell.
My favorite storyteller is Seth Godin.
Nice.
Yeah, I don't know if you know his work or not,
I'm
but
not familiar with it now.
Seth Godin. All you have to do is go to Google and type in Seth. He's
Yeah.
always number one. But he's done a blog, short mostly, every day. He has 7,000 blogs now, and he's a storyteller.
Yeah.
So, what's your story, Chris? Or you already told us, didn't you?
I already told you. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what's the process? Do you actually take what they've written and edit it, or?
Not usually. For me, a lot of what I'm doing, especially when I'm doing, well, when I'm dealing with the clients that I'm working with, as the executives that I'm working with, most of what I'm trying to do is get them comfortable telling their own story. Like so for me, like I will. So a lot of what I do is I tell them, like, the journal isn't for me. You're not doing it for me. You're doing it to capture your own ideas. And when we start talking about things in their past that they want to get better talking about, I will help guide them through it. But it's not my story to tell, it's theirs. And so my job is to just get them comfortable telling their own story. There's nothing worse or more awkward for someone who's asked about something, for example, on their resume, and they're like, like they've never been asked before. So a lot of it is just kind of owning your story. Yeah, this was when I did this, and this is when I did that. So I did so with that of it, it's a lot of it, and with the students, when it comes to as they're pitching their film ideas, for example, a lot of it is just those open-ended questions. What do you find interesting about this? Why is this thing? And you're getting their brain to work, and you're pushing on them to kind of come up with what's the challenge, who's the character, and what's their challenge, and what's this. One of the questions I always ask creatives who are coming up with one of the creative types who are trying to come up with their film ideas or their book ideas, I always ask the question, I'm like, what's your story from 3,000 feet? Because that's going to dictate a lot of the decisions that you make. A lot of the decisions that you make, from the actual creating of the content, become easier once you think about your story from 3,000 feet. So if you think about your podcast, what has my attention from the 3,000 foot level, and you think about what that means to you, every other decision after that becomes easier, because when you're thinking about someone bringing someone on, does this person fit what I want to talk about? Does this person have my attention? Is this topic interesting to me? If it's not, then don't necessarily do it. So a lot of it, when I have students who are trying to come up with their films, I always ask them, what's the story from 3,000 feet? And they might say, it's a redemption story. It's a father trying to, make amends with his son after a horrible fight or something like that. Well, then once you kind of know that, then a lot of those other decisions, become easier, because you know kind of what your story is about. And there, boy meets girl, redemption, race against time. I mean, there are certain story themes that are just kind of universal. And if you can kind of figure out kind of what story you want to tell, then it just makes it easier.
Yeah, there's this whole notion that part of the reason Apple is so successful is because they never forgot their why. And that's So there's a story there, and I'm getting a sense that it would be great to work with you to maybe help somebody that started a company to not forget their why, and also to help them develop their brand.
Sure. One of the exercises that I do, that I run executive teams through, like a leadership team through,
Mm-hmm.
is we have it's a common purpose exercise, and it's basically use design thinking, and you get lots of people writing lots of scribbles and post-it notes all over the boards, and really
Yeah.
what you're trying to come up with is you're trying to come up with kind of a one sentence. What is our team about? What do we stand for?
Mm-hmm.
What is our reason for being? And because what I tell people is once you have that, and if you have it and live it, then everything else, again, a lot of other decisions become easier. It's like, do we expand? Do we lay off? Do we expand? Do we do this? As you're coming these normal decisions that come in running a business, you can hold it up against who you said you were, and say, does this fit with who we said we were and who we wanted to be?
Yeah. Well, as you know, in Mary's workshop, came up with my elevator speech. We're
Sure.
hired by people that keep putting off starting their podcast because
Yep.
it's complicated and expensive. And what they really want is to start a profitable podcast and get their brand and message out there in a bigger way.
Yep.
And I get it. And that's one of the reasons. But recently, because of working with somebody that really has their act together, I've ended up rewriting it, and I'll throw it at you and see how it lands with you, which is, we help companies eliminate competition by elevating their brand and message to be heard.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because what you're basically saying is, and this is really important in a content space,
Mm-hmm.
is you are saying, we're going to help you cut through the clutter. There's a lot of messaging out there, and what we do is we're going to help you cut through the clutter. We're going to help you elevate your message above the din of chatter out there,
And distraction.
and that's a very powerful, that's a very powerful, that's a very attractive proposition. If I'm running a company, and you're saying, hey, I can help you, I can help your message cut through the clutter. When you think about how bombarded we are every day with information and stories and this and that, if your brand promises is that we can help you cut through that and get your message out there, I think that's a very powerful message.
Yeah, I understand there's about 3,000 messages that land on our plate every single day.
Yeah, would not surprise me.
Yeah, and so with the reason I crafted that was with podcasting, it does require you to set it aside some time, whether you're doing dishes, going for a walk, going for a drive, to listen to this conversation that people are listening to right now.
Right. And they've made a choice to do that. And so what's the compelling message for them? What are you offering them?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So can you give me a couple, or even just one actually, case study scenario, a company executive leadership team that you may have worked with as an example?
So I worked with an advertising agency down in North Carolina, who when I worked with they were obviously they're an advertising agency, so they know messaging and know branding and work with their clients all the time, but had not taken that process that they do for so many others, and turned it around to do it for themselves. And so while they had gone through sort of a company-wide audit in terms of they'd set up some company values. We value this, we value that, we value this. They had never really thought, they had not done the work yet as an executive team to do that work for themselves. And so I worked with one of the leaders and the teams to help them come up with kind of their common purpose of which they were going to hold up to their and present to the rest of the company. It was about a 35-person company, and then about about a year or so, a year and a half ago, a year and a half later, they did an internal reorganization, and they basically set up a formal next level down, right? So you had your executive team that I had done the work with, and then for the first time, they set the next level down. So that would be like their senior managers. And they brought me back in to do the same common purpose exercise for that level. Which was great. And so that was it. Again, you had people who, obviously a little bit younger, a little bit earlier in their career, a little bit, so they had different ways of kind of looking at things. And so as a result of which the process, the design process was similar, but the outcomes were different, and the way they approached it was different. And it was really interesting for me. It was interesting for me to compare and contrast, but it was, and again, what it gives you that, what I call sometimes it's that North Star. And again, this is, whenever and then when you get stuck with these, with the harder decisions, are we going to do this as a company? Are we going to do this? How are we going to treat this client? How are we going to treat this employee? How are we going to do all that? To be able to hold up something that says, kind of in simpler, quieter times, we said this about ourselves, is the decision we're about to make consistent with that. And to just have that kind of as a tool, it can be it's very helpful. It's a very helpful tool. And sometimes, you'll find that when people run into trouble, it's because they forgot where what their North Star was. They forgot either why they started doing it, or they forgot, and if you can just reorient them to, okay. But the time to do it is kind of before you're in crisis, or when the time to do it is when you can really spend some time.
I would imagine it would be also very useful for the executive team after going through the process and then having this next level, because it would inform them of that part of the company culture.
Absolutely. And it was a very eye-opening experience for them as well. Both in a way of, seeing their folks, hearing about their folks in that setting, but also to see that messaging.
Mm-hmm. In any media or form of media, do you have a favorite one or two storytellers yourself?
Growing up in the I would say growing up in the TV age, I grew up at a time when, my Sunday evenings were, football. Then we had dinner, and then we all, as a family, sat down and watched 60 Minutes. And that was kind of my parents' sort of required, before you can watch the trash that's going to be on afterwards or whatever. We're all good. So I in terms of broadcasting, I would say 60 Minutes still. What I marveled about with 60 Minutes is how they have managed to broaden the aperture of the stories that they cover, the tone of the stories that they cover, and they still keep the storytelling principles of it. It's still the same solid journalism, whether they're interviewing the president or whether they're interviewing Miley Cyrus. It's the same. The DNA is the same. And so I greatly respect that. CBS Sunday Morning is one of my favorite shows on television. I think that storytelling, again, from a television perspective, is, nails that morning time slot, and is terrific. I'm a big NPR guy. Scott Simon, I think, is a brilliant storyteller. If you listen to Morning Edition on Saturday mornings, kind of that end of his little first A block, he always does a little essay that he's written. And it's just really, really, really powerful. And those are the kind of the audio, the video and audio, the ones that I watch a lot. There's some columnists and writers who I like. And then there's podcasts that I listen to, and those are mostly kind of, segmented in terms of interests, in terms of, so as to 10% Happier, which is a podcast around, meditation and mindfulness. And so those are more,
Yeah.
more utilitarian. Like I use them, I listen to those I'm trying to get something specific out of them. Whereas the others, I'm just basking in the good storytelling.
I find it's a great way to start the day with that particular, like a podcast like that, kind of almost spiritually feed you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just like you said, sets the compass for navigation throughout the rest of the day.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. 10% Happier is one that I do in part because I know Dan Harris is the guy who does it. And he used to, I used to work together at ABC. And so to see him kind of go off in this nice new direction has been very cool.
You know the Sunday night TV shows that nobody talks about that I watched when I was a kid was The Wonderful World of Disney.
Oh, sure. No, it was Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom from 6:30 to 7. Then it was 60 Minutes from 7 to 8, and then it was Wonderful World of Disney. Oh yeah. No, that was my Sunday night. And you think about the genius of those stories. I mean, so many of those stories absolutely hold up. The technology in watching them might feel a little bit old, like to some folks who are used to the CGI and all of the whiz bang, but the story and the characters, they're just as great now as they were before. There was this story. There was a special on TV the other night about the 50th anniversary of Sesame Street, and I remember.
Yes, somebody told me about it.
I watched it, and I was just like, "Yep, they're still telling great stories."
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about favorite stories recently, Queen's Gambit is at the top of my list. I've seen it twice,
Phenomenal.
And I'm glad I did. There was so much to see again.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I found that to be, it truly is they've been saying this for a couple of years now, but I think it's absolutely true. It's a golden age for television. I mean, I would lump streaming into that because that's just a distribution platform. But if you think, all the way back to, if The Sopranos was the first one and you kind of go from there, just that high quality. Queen's Gambit was amazing. The one I binged lately is Marvelous Mrs. Maisel on Amazon. I love the characters. The old New York is really interesting to me. Talk about taking me into a world. One of those thesis questions I ask my students is, what world are you taking me into? But I thought Queen's Gambit was really terrific.
The series that I thought started the whole ball of telling really unique stories was actually 6 Feet Under on HBO.
Yeah, I ended up not watching that. I watched it for 4 or 5. I forget how many seasons it was on.
Yeah,
I watched it
5.
I watched it for maybe the first 3, and then I realized I came to a very painful realization that I didn't like any of the characters. I just didn't like them, and so
they were all flawed.
Yeah, like deeply. Like I don't mind 1 or 2 flawed characters. That makes it interesting. But I really was getting to the point where I was, after about the 3rd season, I was just like, okay, why am I watching this? Like I'm not enjoying this, and so I stopped.
As compared to watching Robert Redford in The Natural.
Well, one of my favorites. If you were to say, what are your top 3, I would say The Wire was probably my favorite.
I haven't seen it.
That was on HBO. It's The Wire. It was about drugs and homicide cops in Baltimore. 5 different seasons, 5 or 6 different seasons. What I loved about it so much is they were telling a really compelling story, and if you couldn't follow along, they didn't care. They weren't patronizing. Like there were a couple of scenes in that series where there was one scene in particular that just was a flash. Like, and if you were down reading your paper or looking, you wouldn't have seen it, but it changed how you viewed one character completely. And they never went back to it again. like to the
Mm.
point where you're kind of like, ooh, did that really happen? So I thought that was terrific. Breaking Bad, I thought was really great. That was just really interesting, quirky characters. Um, which I thought were, and then Justified was one that not as many people know, but I thought that was terrific. And that was, again, just took you into a really, really interesting world, and I thought the characters were fun. But if what are the common themes for me? Interesting world. You're taking me someplace I've not been before. Good storytellers always do that. Really interesting, compelling characters. To your point, they don't always have to be likable, but
Yeah.
there's something in them that you're either rooting for or rooting against, but there's some humanity to them. But yeah, there's some great stuff out there.
Awesome. So let me ask you this question. I'm sure you've had several of these, but in your life, can you actually name one defining moment where everything changed for you?
Yeah, I think the change. Yeah, I can remember it. I can remember the day that took me off on my storytelling career like it was yesterday. I was in 10th grade. I had written an essay for my English teacher about, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I wrote that I wanted to be a TV anchorman in Springfield, Massachusetts. Now I have no idea why Springfield, Massachusetts. I lived in Albany, New York. I was probably about 2 hours away, but no idea why. But I wrote this essay that's what I wanted to do, and this was the mark of a good teacher. This was Mr. Collier, 10th grade English.
Hi, Mr. Collier. Hope he's still alive and can listen.
Exactly. He was handing back our papers, and he said, and he called me up after class, and he said, "Is this really what you think you want to do?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, he's like one of the alumni from the high school just started working at the TV radio station. This was back in the day when they were allowed to be combined, and so." He was just like there. He started working at the TV radio station right down the street from the high school, and I keep in touch with him. Would you like to see if you can spend a day with him? So I'm like, okay, great. So he reached out to the person. The person said yes, he can come and shadow me for the day. I asked my parents. My parents were, said sure, you can not go to school that day and you can spend the day doing that. And so I went, and it was the first time I'd ever been in a TV newsroom, and I just thought it was Disneyland. I thought it was like I liken it to if you remember the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, when he's leading him down that hallway and he opens the big door and all of a sudden there's the factory. That's what it was like for me. I thought it was the coolest place on earth, and there was all these college kids running around kind of answering phones and ripping scripts and doing all this kind of menial gopher stuff. And I'm like, who are they?
Yeah.
and what do they do? They're like, well, they're interns. They're college interns. And I said, well, how do I be an intern? And they're like, well, you need to be 16 years old in New York State to work. So, when you're 16, let me know. A month after my 16th birthday, got out the typewriter, typed a letter saying, I'm 16 now. Can I come back? And they said, sure. And so that was my beginning of end of my sophomore year, beginning of my junior year of high school. And then so 3 days a week, all during all my junior year and all my senior year, I finished school, walked down the street and worked at the TV station. And
that's fabulous.
And
that is really, really fabulous.
Yeah, that was the moment.
Yeah. There's interns are great. If they're doing it because they love it, because that same kind of passion you just expressed.
Yeah.
Such an opportunity, right?
When's the first time you did your first podcast, or what was that moment for?
Sure. Well, in 2004, I'm sitting on my computer, probably using Netscape, and I see this code that kind of looks like the Matrix, but it's not doing this. It's just like, it looks like the Matrix, right? And I saw this little MP3 reference to an MP3 file. I tracked it down to Dave Weiner, one of the co-creators of the RSS2 specification that allowed for embedding of a reference to a file in what's called an RSS feed. I'm sure this is extremely interesting to you. And I will answer the question. And I just found a way to play the MP3, and it was Dave Weiner having breakfast with a guy in Florida. And you can hear him say, "Do you mind if I record this? It's for a project I'm working on." A guy says, "No, that's fine." So I'm like a bug on a wall listening to this
Yeah.
fabulous conversation. And I went, "What is this?" That was 2004. Before it was called podcasting. Back then it was called audio blogging.
Yep.
And then so I just started studying because I was a outside IT guy for Coca-Cola, and I had some chops in terms of research, and just filled myself up with it all. And then in 2005 early, I was at a party, and met this guy named Jeffrey Milburn. And he was kind of a strange guy, but about the same age as myself. And he started telling me this story about this art form he had called Omni Art. And he told me this story about he, years before, being in New York City at a New Year's Eve party, and everybody's doing sex, drugs, and rock and roll, except for Jeffrey and this other guy who he was sitting on a couch with, who happened to be Andy Warhol.
Oh.
So Jeffrey and Andy became really good friends, and they started, the story is, they started sending each other art gifts and stuff like that. And then Andy went into some sort of exploratory surgery in the hospital and died.
Oh.
And Jeffrey said that Andy kind of thought that maybe Omni Art was possibly the next big thing in art. So that left Jeffrey just stranded. So he took it to Madonna, he took it to Sting and a bunch of people like that, and nobody really understood or wanted to do anything with it. And anyway, I just knew at that moment that I had to tell that story, or let that story be told. So we started together in early 2005. The first episode got released in August, called The Omni Art Salon. And then a couple of years went by. I was producing it. He'd show up to my studio and tell an aspect of the story. And anyway, so I said, "Jeffrey, I can't do this anymore, but I'll teach you how to podcast." So I taught him how to podcast, and he's still doing it.
Nice.
So he's had like 250,000 downloads, or probably 500,000 at this point. And he's still doing it. He hasn't really figured out a way to monetize it. Too bad, because it's some pretty darn good content. But that's how I got started. And then somebody called me one day and said, "There's the Upaya Zen Center. Do you know about that?" "No." "Well, they do a Dharma podcast, or they do a Dharma session on Wednesday nights. So I think you ought to talk to Roshi Joan Halifax." So I went there and talked to her, and she says, "Yeah, we record them." So they started passing off the Wednesday night recordings to me, and I created Upaya's Dharma podcast,
Nice.
which they loved, and they started syndicating it into prisons.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was a big deal. So that project, that's still going on. And then, but the one that I just absolutely loved is, one day I got a phone call from a friend of mine that said, "Do you know Jim Turr?" And I go, "No, who's that?" And they said, "Well, he's a radio personality. He's a comedian, and I think you ought to have him on a podcast." I said, "Okay." So Monday morning, I call Jim and tell him that story a friend of yours suggested. And he said, "Okay, I'll be there. When are you available?" And I said, "Well, Wednesday at noon would be great." And he said, "Okay." So Wednesday morning at 9:00, somewhere around there, I get a phone call. And it kind of goes like this. And I've told this story before on other podcasts, but, "Is this Mr. B?" And I went, "It's John." And he said, "Well, this is Buddy. And my buddy Jim Turr said I should give you a call and show up at your studio at 12 noon. So, yeah, sure, show up, So anyway, Jim Turr shows up in character as Buddy, who's this old redneck. And he shows up kind of in a cowboy outfit and a guitar that is badly mistuned. And that started the podcast we did for 36 episodes called Buddy's Old Fashioned Podcast.
Wow. Nice.
Yeah. And I got to tell you, I have never, ever since had so much fun. And it was just so much fun. And Jim mentored me. He showed me how to use, and I had bought really good equipment, NPR style mics and all that, or quality mics. And he showed me how to use the mic, and he showed me about pop filters, and he mentored me, and he's still in Santa Fe doing his thing. But that's really how I got started. And I just thought, oh my God, podcasting, it's like, if you do a 30-minute show on a radio station on Saturday mornings, I know this for a fact because I have a client that wants to anyway, it's costing them $20,000 a year.
Yeah.
And with podcasting, you can do it for as low as a couple $100 a year, depending on how much work you're willing to do. And I just thought, this is going to allow anybody with something or nothing to say to be heard. It just leveled the playing field completely.
Oh, it's amazing what digital technology has done in terms of the barrier to entry to create content. And that's what I tell people, there's no excuse for not doing it, whether that's writing or podcasting or creating videos. It's just, and if you have a passion for something, just do it, because it takes time and effort to develop your voice, right? So you have do you have a sense of kind of what you're interested in, what you want to say, and then it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that ideally it's going to be a message that connects with your audience, and so it takes a while to play with that, to get it, so that you're doing it in a way that's authentic to you and is a way that's connecting with the audience. So that's in terms of tone, that's in terms of how long it is, that's in terms of it takes a while to do it. So the sooner you can get out there and just start playing around, and don't forget the fun aspect. I love how you got that almost giggle in your voice when you're talking about how fun that the Cowboy podcast is. Fun in story is a key ingredient.
I'll tell you, Chris,
people can have fun with that. If people can end the experience and go, well, that was fun, that's a big win.
This is always fun. Every podcast I ever do is fun.
Yeah.
And then it's like, I have editors now, but this one I edit myself because I really do enjoy the editing process and I'm good at it. So I get to hear it again.
Yeah.
I get to hear it again, and it just like, I can't wait to edit this one, because I will get you in terms of what you shared with everybody here again.
Yeah.
And then once I publish it and release it, and it's going to go out on video and audio separately, then I'll watch them again and I'll listen to them again. I might be like doing dishes or having breakfast, but I do it partially because I want to make sure I maintain a high level quality. Yeah. But it's also the content. You cannot get great content anywhere else like you can from podcasting.
Yeah, and what I love about it's the same idea is, people ask me, have asked me what's my favorite medium that I worked in or that I've worked with, and I tell them radio. I think it is by far the most intimate medium. It's just because the technology doesn't get in the way, and especially if you're dealing with folks who are not necessarily used to telling their story, there's something really intimidating about sticking a camera in somebody's face. Whereas if you're just kind of talking with them, the object of the exercise is really, as an interviewer, is really to try to get your subject to forget that they're being recorded. And it's a lot easier to do that when you're just talking to them, on a microphone. I say I find radio to be. I hosted a radio show for a number of years in college, and in grad school, and that was my favorite. I just had a blast because I could really just focus on who I was talking to. I didn't have to worry about the lighting and the whiting and the framing and all that. And it's really because your mind and your brain has to use a little bit of imagination.
Exactly. It's like reading a book.
Yeah.
Reading a book versus watching a movie. With a book, you have the creative process of filling in the blanks. Yeah.
No, I in fact, I am a big baseball fan. Baseball on the radio is my favorite way to consume it. The ambiance of the ballpark, the announcer, the whole thing. I think it's just such a really intimate experience that's very cool.
Yeah, it's really great. Well, let's wind it up. Anything you want to include?
No, I think story can change the world, and I truly do believe that everybody has one. And I just encourage people to, to find and live theirs, whatever that is, and whatever you take that to mean, because Yeah, everyone has a story, and take time to hear others.
Regarding getting in contact with you, if you're watching the video, you'll see sspconsulting.net.
Yeah.
Is that the only and best way to get in touch with you, or?
That's probably the best way to get in touch with me. If you go there, there's a contact form that you can reach out to, which is probably the best way to get a hold of me. It's got a phone number. It's got some contact. It's got a contact fill form, and just mention the podcast in it, so I know where the consultation comes from, as opposed to some of the spam that I get. That would be great.
Do you have anything special coming up, or you're pretty much working one-on-one, right?
I do mostly one-on-one, and I do some companies, and of course I do some. I work with some nonprofits who I do messaging work.
So I was going to ask you earlier, and I didn't, so I'll ask it now: is who do you consider to be an ideal client?
I work mostly with executives in transition, and you can define transition kind of however you want. I have people who are helping. I'm helping find new jobs. I have people who I'm helping kind of transition from one place to another, and for me it's executive and teams in transition, and again, where I focus on a lot of it is I start with their own story, and we talk a lot about their own story, and I try, and part of what I hope I equip them with is just a better ability just to tell their own story. So they're showing up in authentic ways, and they're communicating in ways that can connect with their audience, however you define their audience. And that's mostly who I work with.
It seems to me it makes sense to actually bring somebody like you in earlier rather than later, right?
Yeah, it's understanding that. I was interviewing for a potential position one time, and they were talking about me coming in to help a troubled executive kind of right the ship, and we had a long, thoughtful conversation about whether you're better off spending time on helping a troubled executive who has repeatedly been in trouble. Are you better off, giving executive coaching to give him one last shot, or are you better off spending that executive coaching and helping the new person land in the most effective and strong way? And I made the argument for the second. We think a lot about, companies spend a lot of time and energy trying to reform, executives who aren't managing in ways that are consistent with how we expect people to manage these days. And in my opinion, spend not enough time helping new executives land in a way that where they can be most impactful, and help them tell their story from the beginning. So,
yeah, awesome.
Yep.
Get a hold of Chris at sspconsulting.net. And Chris, thanks for being here. It was really, really a treat.
Thanks, John. I enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to more.
If you'd like to start a quality podcast show, visit imaginepodcasting.com.